I just wanted to acknowledge country. We meet today on the Wurundjeri lands, and in Melbourne we are particularly good at making sure we represent Melbourne storytellers. On one of the sides of your buildings you have William Barrack, and he's a very interesting part of the Melbourne story, but early land rights before it was called Land Rights Campaigner. Go and seek out this and other stories about our Indigenous people so that they're better represented in our culture today. I'd like to turn now to our panel today, which is travel baggage. It's about the things that we pack before we even know we're packing them, our emotional selves. We think of travel as a wonderful escape, a way to get away from who we are, but we just keep finding ourselves. In the case of Sheridan, it's in a rear vision mirror. In Lisa's case, it's in a Zen pond, which throws back her own reflection. Before we kick off, we'll do some readings, we'll have a little bit of a chat amongst ourselves, and then I'd really like to make sure we have some time for your questions. So Sheridan needs no introduction to us. She is a very accomplished screenwriter, and she wrote Easy Virtue, which is no small feat, an adaptation of a very big work. And she is also known as, within the Guinness Book of Records, I believe, as the youngest celebrity chef from her program Cooking with Sherry. She has written her...
Unique.
Her book, I Wish You Were Here, takes another turn though. It's a part of her life where her life was not so sunny, and she took to travel to try and work through this. I wonder if you could read a little portion for us today.
Yeah. Just as a prelude, I'd like to introduce my travel companion, a red 1989 Chevy Camaro called Betty. Just I have to also take my glasses off to read. As I drove out of LA, the tension peeled away. It was even better than I'd imagined. Cross my heart and hope to die, there's nothing as satisfying as living a fantasy. I'd wanted to run away from home since I was a kid, and finally, there I was, a runaway at 35. Crossing the border from California into Arizona, I started to yip and holler and slap the side of the car. This is who I was, an air-conditioned gypsy, a free spirit on my way to the wild frontier. I played all my CDs instantly. I ran Baby Ran with Sheryl Crow. I drove. I thought, chip, this looks like Australia. I flamenco guitar with Ali Farka. I knew I did that. Ali Farka touring. I played the soundtrack of The Last Temptation of Christ, which has to be the sexiest piece of music ever written. Betty could feel it too as she rose and fell on her appalling shock absorbers to the sound of the drums. No one else was on the road, not a soul, and it was hot, desert hot. The horizon was wide and the trees were weird. The sky was high and benign, soft ambers and deep blues. I was wearing my red spotty dress. I like the red spotty dress. I'm wearing it now. The sensuality that underlaid this moment was deep and eternal. The utter physicality of beauty, it was spiritual, transcendent, erotic. The reds floated orange into turquoise. A body breeze through the window was 1,000 curious fingers caressing my being. The expectations of this journey are all caught in that moment and suspended as an outstanding life memory. It lies in the same mental file as a honeymoon swim at Marble Bar in Western Australia, the pale mauve light of Fiesole outside of Florence, a cloud rolling in over Mount Penang, rounding a distant path in the Himalayas to Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma, and my first perfect love throwing rice over me on a wedding anniversary because I told him I feared the absence of it at our wedding had caused my infertility. But they're only memories. This was the perfect now. In this moment, I am perfect. I am free to be whoever I want, and all I want to be is a woman in a red spotty dress speeding into her future in a shiny red car.
That was great. I love those moments too when you travel and you go, shit, this is just like Australia. You think that the lens is going to change. We might hear from Lisa Dempster, who probably also needs no introduction. She is the festival director of the Melbourne Writers Festival. She is the reason we are all here. For 5 fantastic years, Lisa has been the festival director, doing some fantastic innovative programming. This year, I think, is an amazing activist program from her in which she's selected speakers who are so interesting. Some of them you may not have heard of, but they have messages that are really worth hearing. But this is a book that came from a time before that, when Lisa was in another self, I suppose, as well. And she is doing a pilgrimage through Japan of 88 temples, and perhaps I'll just throw over to you to see if there's anything else you need to set up.
Thanks, I'm going to read from the start of the book. I haven't read in about 10 years and I'm a bit croaky from 8 days of festival, so please forgive me. When I was a teenager, I went to Japan. As an exchange student, I spent a culture-shocked year living in and attending school in Kochi, a rural city on the smallest of the 4 main islands, Shikoku. In the 90s, foreign tourists rarely went to Shikoku, and with good reason. There's not much to do there. And so, although I had an enormous guidebook to Japan, the entry for Shikoku occupied a few miserable pages in my Lonely Planet. And for a 15-year-old, we're fairly lackluster in the excitement department, except for one small box of text. Pilgrims have been walking clockwise around Shikoku for some 1,200 years. They follow in the footsteps of the great Buddhist Daishi, who achieved enlightenment on the same journey. The walk is an arduous task, no less than 1,200 kilometres around the island, and 88 temples in all. ... I knew nothing about Buddhism, nothing about the history of religious pilgrimage, and nothing about hiking. But my imagination was ignited. The pilgrimage exists to venerate Kobo Daishi, a 9th century Buddhist monk and one of the most important figures in Japanese history. It is almost impossible to exaggerate the impact the Daishi had on Japanese society. A scholar, priest, teacher, and administrator, he's a cultural icon and hero, still revered by Japanese people today. And one of the many ways in which Japanese society continues to pay homage to Kobo Daishi is to undertake a pilgrimage on the island of his birth, Shikoku. The 88 temples included on the Henro Michi, literally the Pilgrim's Road, were chosen for their importance in the history of the monk. Of the 88 temples, 61 are located in the mountains and 27 are on the plain near the coast. In some areas, the temples are close together and it's possible to visit several in one day. In other, more rural areas, it can take up to 3 days to walk between them. The toughness of undertaking the Henro Michi cannot be understated, and the hiking all comes back to the Daishi. Pilgrims believe that his spirit still lives in Shikoku, and that by travelling the pilgrimage, they will be walking in his presence. To venerate him, yes, but also to seek some kind of fortune in their own lives. As a teenager, I would occasionally see these pilgrims, these Henro, cutting a figure through town. With their white robes, wooden religious staffs, and well-worn backpacks, they were delightfully foreign and represented all the romance and adventure that I, as a 15-year-old, was longing to have. The pilgrimage was, in my mind, adventure travel on an epic scale. It fit with my worldview of myself as a dusty, travel-worn explorer. Well, I would be one day. I made the decision to return to Japan to walk the Henro Michi one way or another as soon as humanly possible.
Thank you, that was lovely. Both of your books have moving as a kind of meditation. You know, it's very conscious in a pilgrimage, but also in driving and things. What do you think it is about driving or walking, in your cases, that helps you to think and process?
Well, personally, I think, especially if you're having a bad time or you're depressed, I think making decisions can be really uplifting, like as an actual thing to do. And when you're traveling, you get to make a lot of micro decisions that are rewarding. So I'm going to go here, you know, let's just do it, let's leave. I'm going to sleep late, I'm going to get up early, I'm going to meet that guy, and all those decisions ultimately start to reaffirm that the world is all right and that you're in control. Because I think one of the things of, in my case, you know, being divorced in 18 months out of the relationship and just feeling hopeless, was I could make a decision. I couldn't decide to get pregnant, I couldn't decide to, but I could decide to go. And that felt, well, it felt awesome.
There are so many of those in the book too, where you go, I'll just go for another town, or I'll, you know, I'll keep driving too late.
Even saying that, like you said that, and all I see is Kingsville. It was 4 o'clock in the morning in the middle of nowhere, and I rejected the bridal suite some 5 hours earlier because it was $135, and it looked like a penitentiary crossed with a Kmart, and it was like, that was the bridal suite. It was just like, no, and I kept going, and it turned out that the American Open was on, and so everything was closed, and then all the exits were closed, and then they started to say, don't even think about leaving here, there's nothing open. So I ended up in one of those Motel 6s, like they're meant to be $6 a night. I turned up at 4 o'clock in the morning, just last legs. I'm glad I didn't kill myself. $135 for the bridal suite.
And who gives a single woman a bridal suite? It's almost thrown up in your face. Yeah. So what about you? I mean, walking is very crucial to your book, and it is something that gives you a lot of time to think. How does it help you process, do you think?
Walking is very central to the book. I walked 1,200 kilometres and the book covers it in excruciating detail. I will just say briefly, I love that scene in your book where you're trying to find a hotel room. I think in it there's all the frustration and madness of travel, and yeah, just learning those little lessons along the way. It's absolutely brilliant. For me, the point of walking then and now is that it's a very quiet activity. It's very slow. Not everyone is slow, but I'm a very slow walker. And I think, you know, we live in cities. I have a very frenetic, energetic job. And there's something about when you go out on the trail, you're instantly forced to completely slow down, especially when you're doing something that goes for a long time, that's multi-day, because you're carrying your whole life with you, literally on your shoulders, physical baggage. And you're forced to really stop and slow down and take care of yourself in a quite primal way, where in the city when I'm working, it's like, get up, have coffee, have breakfast, go, have more coffee, but when you're on the trail, you really have to have a good breakfast, wait a while, walk, think, you know, really slow, and all that kind of self-care. Of course, I didn't learn when I was doing this, I have learned since then, but there's just a real slowness to walking that I think encourages the turning of the cogs in the mind.
Yeah, I think, you know, there is a development of self-care within this book. You know, you do sort
a little bit.
Yeah, there's a really unique way of dealing with blisters that you learn too. I wonder if you could demonstrate that today on someone's feet.
Does anyone have a blister? It's quite extraordinary. One of the things that I did was I just went to Japan very quickly and had no training or experience in hiking at all. I was very unfit when I went. Just made every bad decision essentially. And so I walked for the first week, had a really hard time, was walking very slowly. I stupidly went in summer, so it was very hot, humid. Everything went wrong basically. And one of the things that went wrong is I developed these enormous blisters. And has anyone here done a multi-day hike or like Oxfam Trail Walker or yeah, right? So you know what I'm talking about. My blisters had blisters. I had blisters between my toes. Like the whole sole of my foot was one big blister essentially. And I stopped at a temple and I really was in a very bad way. I was sort of crying and took my shoes off because I thought a bit of air might help. I don't know what I was thinking really. And a Japanese man came to help me. And one of the generosities he gave me was that he taught me how to take care of blisters, which is to take a needle and thread, and to thread the needle through the blister, allow all the pus to drain out, put a bit of betadine on it, and then put a Band-Aid on it. which as a solution I never would have come up with on my own. So my blisters healed that first time, and I was able to take care of my blisters for the rest of the walk, and I never had another problem with my feet and haven't since then. So yeah, it's quite amazing.
It's really tender in the book when he helps you, because you reject the help at first.
Yes.
And doing the walk with her, if you read the book, is just a joy. It's like having a little holiday, and kind of you get to go through the process as it grows. And when this man comes, I was literally going, "Oh, come on, Lisa, you can't walk on them."
It's true. The book is very visceral. There is some of those things there. There is a lot of spewing too, as Lisa sort of works out self-care, I think. There's a lot of times where I think you finish a hike and you have a beer at a vending machine. But it's those micro decisions I think are really interesting. Those little things that you do when you travel. You find yourself saying, well, this everyday problem I have in life is nothing like trying to work out the bus system in Russia, or trying to find a place to sleep that is.
There's something about asking for help in both books as well. I think two strong women who've made a decision to try and find themselves or find what was needed in their lives. I mean, we both had the same problem of at different points needing help and not being asked for it. In my case, I ended up in a Navajo reservation, and with no understanding of culture and furious about the car having broken down. This was one of Betty's better decisions, as it turned out, but at the time I couldn't see it. And it was like trying to crash another culture, and I thought I'll hire somebody to come and help me. And it was like I was asking to hire a wetsuit in the middle of the Arizona desert. It was like people were just blinking at me like you. And I started saying, $5 to drive me home, and I ended up at $70 with a local policeman and his son. And it was one of the most memorable days of my life. They took me around and explained the country to me, and we talked about our family and our parents, and it was really a special moment because of that. So asking for help with the feet is what made me think of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was, like you, just very independent woman and never wanted help from anyone. And one of the things that happened on this hike is that, I spoke at the start about how the island is the birthplace of this monk, and the pilgrimage is very big there. And there's a sort of a system on the island of anyone who sees a pilgrim, they give them help and assistance. So they really try to help them along their way. So it might be sort of teaching someone about blisters or giving them cold drinks or money in some cases. So I went wanting to look after myself and be my usual independent self, and literally every step along the way there was someone there trying to give me things and trying to help me, and it took a long time. For the first, quite a while, I was like, no, I can do it. And then slowly breaking down and realising I can't do everything on my own, and I do need the help of these beautiful angels who appeared along the way.
And the grace that comes with that is incredible, like the sense of connectedness to people, like when you help somebody and they say thank you. That learning to say thank you rather than, I'm sorry to put you out, or but just, human being, he saw me, yay.
There's a physical token, isn't there, that you give, a piece of paper, a card that you give to people. Yeah,
absolutely. So I had little sort of religious, spiritual business cards essentially where I write my name down, and of course everyone wanted one from a foreigner, so they were in hot demand. Everyone wanted to help me. I like to think it's because I was a foreigner, but it really is because I was clearly very out of my depth. But I found it a real burden at first because the transaction would be someone, random stranger would come and help me. I would have to accept it and thank them, give them this little business card, and then move on. And I felt a deep burden and sort of obligation in doing that because I knew there was no way I could ever repay those people individually, or the island and the community more generally. So I had to give up that sense of reciprocity and really accept that at this time they were there for me, and that was hard.
And also those tokens have real value too. I think there's a character who has a whole folder of them, and separates out folders into ones from foreigners, ones from
so if you are a rookie like me, you have paper ones, and then the more times that you've walked the pilgrimage, you get fancier and fancier. They're name slips, they're called. And so if you've walked over 100 times, you're allowed to give out gold ones. So they're these beautiful embossed, and there's silver and all sorts of things. And yeah, one day I was walking and a man sort of popped out of his house and said, come in, I'll give you some ice cream. And I was like, okay, I come in, and he shows me all his folders, and he literally has, he's since retired, just sort of sat in his home and popped out to help pilgrims that were walking past and kept all their name slips in a folder. And one of the crazy things that's happened since doing this hike is I published this book that George has about a decade ago and have updated it into this version. But someone read that book and went and did the pilgrimage off the back of it. I don't know why. Most people who read it think they never want to walk anywhere ever again. And the same man popped out. So this was a man from Sydney, and the man popped out of the house and brought him in, showed him the folders, and my name tag is in there, my name slip. And so he Facebooked me, and we've been friends ever since. So it's like this whole world of bringing people together.
Oh, there is something really lovely about writing books, and you never really know how it's going to be received. You've inspired someone to go out and travel. In turn, the person who wrote that Lonely Planet Fox text inspired you to go and do this.
Yes, was it you? Because
No, it
you worked
wasn't
for
me.
Lonely Planet. I've often wondered.
No, anything good that happened in Lonely Planet, I didn't do. But the other interesting thing here is that as two solo women travellers, you have that kind of trust thing. I think you were in Chicago and you had a gentleman who you worked out very quickly that he was dodgy.
Yeah, basically I stayed in a youth hostel, and I, even at 35, was way too old to do that. But having not done the gap year or not travelled in this way before, I thought I'm going to do that. And also to meet people, because you don't meet a lot of people in hotels. And as a solo woman traveller, I'd been avoiding bars as well. Just I thought that might be a dodgy place to hang out. So I stay in this place, and I'm greeted by Fats, who is like the classic beached American. He's got his world to revolve around him from his couch, where he sits with a television at one end, his guest book and keys out the side, and for all I know, a bottle under the couch for peeing. And he just, I didn't in the time I was there see him leave. And so he greeted me and he said, "Oh, here's the key. Sign the registry, and would you like a can of mace?" And it was like, no. I'm in Southside Chicago, and I know it's fine. I've got a Chevy Camaro. She knows how to fight for me. And then another guest in the hostel leapt up, and he didn't blink. And I don't know if guys are aware of this, but women will sync their blink rate to men. And so when a man doesn't blink, you quite quickly become aware that you're sort of doing this. Like, and there was a bit too much white at the top of the eye, and I thought, oh no, he's in the D range. I'm not too sure which D range he is, but he's definitely deranged. So I went into the room and came out, and he was very solicitous, and he was going to make me sandwiches. It's all good American hospitality. It was all genial. And then he brought out Fatherland and the flags, and he was basically a young Nazi. And also in the D range. So I'm sort of going, okay, that's who the mace is for. Well, at least I've been signposted. And it was interesting in that in the end, I did not know how to get rid of him. I didn't go out. I stayed in the next morning. I'm thinking I'll just get up early and leave. There he is. I don't think he slept at the door, being solicitous. No, I'm going to go get breakfast. I'll show you where to get breakfast. He ended up coming to breakfast, and I had a name of somebody in Chicago, and I had rung and she wasn't there, so I rang again and she answered the phone, and I said, could I say I'm coming to lunch with you? Can we go to lunch? No, she couldn't do lunch. Can you tell me somewhere to go to lunch so I can pretend I'm going to see you? It took me this long to work out I could just say no, go away. Like, I'm still being polite and accessible and ladylike and like. So she then said, well, go to the restaurant at the top of the world or whatever it was, but you now need to ring me at the end of this and tell me that you're safe, because now I'm worried about you. So I was like, okay, I'm really starting out more than I could. And by now he had totally revealed himself to be, just mad, and I was able to finally go, no, go away. And it was like, and then I rang her to say that I'd survived. But in all of this, the only time that Fats got off the chair was to come over to me as we were leaving together and to say, just don't start drinking with him. I was like, no shit, Shirley. Any other tips? And it was like, and he was looking at me, and I thought, he's making a note of my face to tell the police.
And doesn't he suggest a breakfast drink as well? Like he says, you know, why don't we do this over a few beers and eggs?
Yeah. So yeah, one of the things I was telling George earlier, this was one of the sections that the editor had wanted to take out, and I had a fantastic editor. I loved the process. She'd done Almost French and Holy Cow, and I think she was really sensitive to the female journey in a way. But this one I wanted to keep in. One, it was to show that it was funny, but also I think there are real dangers for a solo female traveller that perhaps men don't have. Like On the Road doesn't talk about, you know, the idea of some woman maybe wanting to indoctrinate them into, you know, fascism or drunk or get them lost. So I was pleased we were able to leave it in, and I think it works well. I think she wanted to take it out because I'd done a bit too much American bashing in that draft. And she quite rightly, because she pointed out that I wasn't acknowledging a lot of the great hospitality I had. So this was one example where I thought the hospitality perhaps could be rejected.
We might get to redrafts in a moment, but Lisa, do women write travel differently, I think you've said. What's the difference, do you think?
That's a big question, but to draw on what Sheridan was saying, I think women experience travel differently than men because our position in the world is subjugated, sorry, but it's true. And so women are generally in more danger when they're out in the world. I've always been very annoyed when people have asked me, you know, if I'm telling them I'm going to Japan or, you know, going hiking, going riding, whatever. Oh, but is that safe? Because I feel like women are taught to be very scared about the world, and it is a scary place. But I think that fear keeps us captive in a lot of ways. And one of the reasons why I included a few anecdotes in my book about moments where I felt more unsafe because of men were because they did happen, but then I was able to sort of get out of those situations as well. So nothing really bad, luckily, ever happened in the book or in my life, which is great. And I think when women travel, the reason why they write differently is because they go into different kinds of communities than men do. People are more likely to look after a woman, for better or worse, especially a solo woman traveller. They get invited into different kinds of spaces, and I don't necessarily want to say they're more likely to go on an emotional journey, but I think when I read books by female travel writers, there is that sometimes more of a sense of humanity and really trying to understand the people around them and the situation around them, whereas I grew up reading travel books by men. One of the reasons why I wanted to write a travel book is because there aren't a lot of adventure travel books written by women, unfortunately, and men sort of tend to be explorers and conquerors, and I know that's very sort of divisive in terms of, you know, gender relations and things like that, but I think the sexes do bring different perspectives to how they travel and write about it.
That's what I thought when you said Jack Kerouac. I said, you know, they're questing and conquesting.
I just love that thing about the fear of the world. That's really well observed. When I was going, everybody kept saying, "Oh, aren't you frightened you'll be murdered?" It's like, no, I'm driving at high speed on the wrong side of the road. I'm going to die in a car accident. Crazy people. But I had put it down to that, to be frightened of the world, which is like, the flip side of the subjugation or the fear of being conquered is that incredible generosity and protection. Having subsequently raised a 14-year-old boy who I inherited from my sister, and he would go into the world and people wouldn't stop for him, taxis wouldn't stop for him. One night he got a lift home in a police car because it was the only car that would stop for a group of 4 14-year-olds. So there is a different sort of, as well, like the vulnerability of the young 14-year-old who looks like a 24-year-old, you know, is a different sort of world as well.
You both redrafted these books, Lisa. You've got another edition, and I understand that the original has 20,000 more words in it, and many of the words you've removed from this new edition are swear words. Is that right? That's 20,000 right there, just in the F word.
I'm looking at my friend Helen, who has spoken to me several times about the excessive swearing in the first edition.
I'm doing very well today.
But what happens when you go back and you look at your younger self as a writer and redraft, and how do you adjust, do you think, when you write another edition of your book?
For me, there were two things. One is that writing now a someone who's 10 years older, I have more distance from the experience and more maturity, and I understand what happened in a different kind of way. I didn't rewrite it in the sense that anything in the narrative shifted, but I did take 20,000 words out. So just the second part of it is wanting to tighten up the narrative, because the first one was written very rapid fire, very quickly. I did want to be a bit of a Kerouac, to be honest, just to sort of madly write all the mad things that happened. And there's a great energy to the first book because of that, I think, and people really responded to that. But considering it as someone a little bit older, I did want to be a little bit more considered and consider the narrative more deeply, and I think it's a better book for it. And that's rare as hen's teeth now, even I don't have a copy.
Straight on eBay after this. You've added an afterword too, because I really liked the original ending, and Lisa's put a little bit more on there. I really liked that the end was sort of like dot, 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 and you had to kind of keep thinking yourself. What was behind that decision, do you think?
I think there's just been an interest. The reason why this book was republished is because I was invited to read a letter at the Women of Letters, which is a great literary event. And it was a letter to the time I got a tap on my shoulder. And when I read the letter, I immediately thought of the pilgrimage and an event that had happened along the way, which was sort of very spiritual and magical. And I knew I had to talk about that. And I think a lot of people in the room knew me as the director of the Melbourne Writers' Festival and didn't necessarily know the journey I'd taken to get here. And so my publisher was particularly interested not just in the hiking book, but also thought people would be interested in how I transitioned from one to the other. And so again, with that sort of distance of time, I did just want to have that moment of reflection. And for people who have bought the first book, it's a bit of a value add, because you get a little extra chapter at the end.
So I'm going to have to buy this again.
But as George said, you don't have to read it, and I really love that you said that, because I do think you can read the book without the afterword as well.
Sherry, you of course rewrote this. Originally, this was a love letter to your partner.
Yeah, I wrote the first lot on the road. So there are two stops in the journey. One in Washington and one in LA at the end. And the first time I was actually waiting for who became subsequently my husband, and is in the audience, plot spoiler.
So it works out.
It's a rom-com. It's got a happy ending, So the first half I was writing, and that was the leaving of a marriage and the experiences on the road. And then the second half was how I completed the journey. And that was very raw. It was snippets of conversation. I did the whole of the Navajo in that chapter is original. And then several years later, as the relationship had developed, I wanted to write something for Scott that had become, just to say what he meant to me and what that time meant to me, and to be, just. So that I describe as a love letter to my husband. And then I found that was something that I was often giving to girlfriends who were having a hard time or couldn't leave the house or new babies, or just to sort of say, look, great things happen from bad times, or sometimes good things happen to good people for no reason, like it's going to be all right. And they liked it enough, so when there was a lull in the screenwriting, I rewrote it as a commercial piece, which got an agent, which got this work, and then so it's gone through 4 drafts, because then the professional editor came in and, as you say, streamlined the narrative, and also I think made it a kinder work. But at each stage, revisiting the 35-year-old, I saw more beauty and grace in the journey and in her story, and I think the final result reflects more realistically and more beautifully the grace of the journey, and the grace that is life, and the grace that is relationships and love. And each point I was slightly higher away from the emotions. And the final conclusion that I came to was that love is like the sun, that when you're really close to it, it's this great big orb, and it's hot and it's warm and it's shining on you, and you are it. And as you move away from it, it doesn't die or change, but it becomes a star in the sky, and all the love that we have for our family and our friends and our partners And our children and our dogs and our strangers and the people that we connect with are all the stars in the sky. It doesn't get changed, and that was the distance of rewriting for me.
And I just wanted to pick up also on editors there too. I mean, they're the invisible writers of books.
Editors.
There may be some editors in the audience, and you should know that you make books.
That's their brain. Bring it in.
Yeah, writers produce manuscripts, but editors make books. I wonder if, unless you have anything else, if we could turn to the audience. We've got a little bit of a surprise at the end too, with questions. But if you do have a question in the audience, some people aren't familiar with the format of questions. They're generally a sentence with a question mark at the end. Several sentences put together are a paragraph, and they're a great start for a blog entry. But today we're going to go mostly for one sentence with a question mark, and our wonderful volunteers, I think, are moving with mics throughout the audience. So if you could just wait for a volunteer. We've just got one right here.
I was wondering if your experiences have changed the way you encounter other people who are travelling in your life.
I think in my life I've always tried to help travellers, so I've always had a pretty open home, and one of the things that happens when you travel is you collect friends and strangers, sometimes from all around the world, and I've always loved hosting people who are travelling at my home, and it's a very tricky thing to host a traveller sometimes. You don't know whether they want care and to be looked after and to be mothered and all those kinds of things, or whether they just really want a shower, sleep, and then to get out the door again. So trying to figure out what those needs are. But I think helping travellers as travellers have been helped themselves is just a really beautiful feeling.
Yeah, I come from an open household here as well, and we always had Sunday lunch in which you could invite anybody home, and frequently there were people who were just transient in town, and there always seemed to be two strangers at Christmas lunch, and very much travellers have always been a part of it. So no, I don't think it changed that, but it certainly changed the appreciation of what a lifetime as because of my family's generosity, what that meant to people. So yeah, no, I'm always welcoming of travellers, because there's bound to be one in my family at some point somewhere.
Thanks. I was just wondering, both of you seem to have really thrown yourself into, a travel experience in your 20s or 30s, and it's really interesting to hear you reflect back on that. Being sort of vaguely, early 30s myself, I just wondered how you got the courage, I guess, or how you trusted that going into an adventure like that, not knowing what would happen or if it was a good decision or not. Were those questions that you had, or did you just kind of go for it?
I think you should start with that, because your journey's one. Actually, maybe I've known you. Tabula rasa, for me, was the motivation. That I was empty. I had a clean slate. There was nothing to lose. I didn't need to find somebody to look after the cat. Anybody who wanted to come on the journey could come with me, but I was empty, and there was nothing for it but to start again. And what I took from the chaos of the emptiness, the broken cup, the empty vessel, was that you don't actually have to break the vessel or empty it in order to seize life. And so if you have obligations and duties that are keeping you here, you only do those because you are loved by those duties and obligations, that there is something fulfilling for you. If they're in any way holding you down, cut that tie and go. This is your life, live it.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is probably unsatisfying to hear, but I am always someone who's thrown myself into things, so it does come very naturally to me. I went to Japan as a 15-year-old, I went to Europe as a 19-year-old. I've always just saved my money and gone out into the world. So I do think in some people it's probably innate in a way. But also at the time I did this, I had nothing to lose as well. I was very depressed, I was very unfit, I was on the dole, I really couldn't keep the threads of my life together. I moved back home with my mum, which in your late 20s is Devo, really bad. And I had nothing to lose, you know, and so, because I do have that natural inclination to throw myself into things, I just went. I had no money, I went at the wrong time of year, and it does all work out. The joys of living in the world that we live in is you can always come home very quickly. If it doesn't work out, you're always connected. Social media is there, the phones are working, you text your parents. There's so many safety nets now that I think it's sort of wrong not to go. If there's a little spark in there, I reckon just do it.
And also the universe rewards action.
Yeah.
It really does. Do something, something will happen.
Do we have any other questions there? I think it's also interesting.
Those ones up the back, you're in the light.
Yeah, so you put your hand up really high.
Or wave.
I was just wondering, at the end of the Neon Pilgrim, there was a real sense of well-being that you had, but there's also a sense that you're feeling a little bit of a letdown, which is something I've experienced myself with travel. I wonder how that worked out for you when you got back, and how did you integrate?
I reckon you've got the original book too, haven't you?
Yes.
And you
Die Hard
friends,
fans, yes.
to get where you are now.
Well, the afterword covers a bit of that, so. But integrate is the right word, and what happened at, I talked about one of the reasons why I went is because I had nothing left to lose, and one of the phrases that comes out a lot in the early book is hike or die. I really had that mentality of like, I'm going to hike or, not come back. And it was a bit of a surprise. A spoiler, I didn't die, I didn't make it. It was a bit of a surprise when I reached the end, which you would know, having read the book, and I wasn't sure what to do next, but what I got out of doing the pilgrimage was I had walked myself back into a physical health, and I had the energy to come back to Melbourne and throw myself back into my life, so I found work very quickly, and all those sort of life laundry things that we needed to pay the bills, see your friends, came very naturally because I had a much higher energy, so that was very useful. But one of the things I've learned in the 10 years since then is that life is sort of cyclical, and I think reading my book, I don't want to give anyone the sense that you can do this one thing and then you cure it for the rest of your life. If you're someone who suffers from mental health issues or just life is really hard. There's probably going to be a lot of times in your life where you're like up and energetic and then down, and so there's this constant sort of sense of having to look after yourself in a variety of different ways, and that's the biggest learning for me as someone who's now nearly 40, is that there's no cure in doing these things.
Life is a mental health issue.
Sure is, especially for women.
Do we have any other questions? Maybe right out the back there.
The other one is that life's a journey, not a destination. I mean, you if it ends, it's kind of it's a done ending, basically.
Hi, I have a question about souvenirs. You both have a book, it's probably the best possible memento, but how else do you remind yourself that wherever you are, you've been through these experiences?
For me, halfway through the journey, my travel companion decided to create a mnemonic record of the journey. I had gone on to this not wanting to take any technology. I work in film and television. I didn't want to take a camera. I didn't want to take any record of it, which is why I ended up writing it down when I got to the other end. And when he arrived, I was going to make a joke then, and then I chose not to. It's kind of about wedding vows. I'm not allowed to make fun of him in public for comedy value. And so we got into an argument about, I don't want you taking pictures all this time, or can I record it on a DAT? I mean, he's an audiophile, he carries sound equipment with him like nuts. No, you can't, this is just bad filmmaking. And in the end, he told me about a Russian mnemonist, one of those words you don't hear said so often, so a mnemonist, and called Luria, and his subject was S, and S could do a journey and tell you everything in it. He had an eidetic memory and was synesthetic and could taste colours and hear sounds. That wouldn't be very synesthetic, would it? Hear flavours. And so we started to record the moment. So that was our first one, which was at the which memorial? It's the
Lincoln.
No, it was the other one. It was Jefferson. It was at the Jefferson Memorial. Thanks, though. It was after that. The fight was at the Lincoln. That was at the Jefferson. But so the very first of the mnemonic recordings is it's at sunset. The sky is that sort of pale aqua blue. There is gravel on the floor. The Jefferson Memorial is quite small and is surrounded by this white gravel. There's somebody else talking softly. It's a hot summer's day, but it's cooling now. The river's coming off the Potomac and it's blowing through the trees. There are flowers that have been planted at a border of high green grass, and I can actually feel his skin. He's standing to the left of me, and it was like for 1 minute we stood in the silence and we just made a note of all the things that were happening. And in the end, I think we did about 26 of these. And if you say a place, I can feel, even down to, there are 2 that we didn't record that are false recordings. One where we're totally in harmony with the moment. And in fact, I took a photograph of that, but we didn't make a recording. And another one where I made a recording, but he didn't, because I had been mocking Elvis. And that had annoyed him and our other travel companion at the point. And so what's in that recording for me is actually the frisson of tension that I have done something wrong. And although the memory is of an Australian country town in Texas, so that's what it is. He is a Welshman. He didn't have the evocation of that town, so it was meaningless to him. So even though we made that recording, it's a false recording because it's not shared. So that's what we did.
What about you, Lisa? Any
I
souvenirs?
love that. I try not to get souvenirs when I travel because I've moved house a lot of times, and if anyone's moved house a lot of times, you know you're just always packing up crap. The last time I moved, I had a box of postcards that I'd picked up in Europe when I was 19, thinking that I would do an art project or something like that, and then carried around for 20 years. So since then I've learned. I did throw them out in the end. I'm like relentless about throwing things out or giving them away. But the one beautiful souvenir I do have from the hike, the pilgrimage, is that at each, I got a little book, and at each temple the priest would sign the book, so special stamps for each temple in beautiful Japanese calligraphy. And so I've got an embroidered book that has the stamps of 89 temples that I visited along the way, and that's a very special object, and it's very special to people in Japan as well. It's very much seen as a good luck talisman to have these things. I had one for myself, but quite a few people who are doing the pilgrimage will travel with 4 or 5 of them to get the signatures in them and then give them to family members who are sick or getting married and things like that. So it's very powerful.
So walking around with 3 or 4 books to get signed, that's a good help, I think, too. There were some other questions just sort of up there.
I'm just wondering, the idea you had before about redrafting, how do you ensure that 10 years on, when you redraft the book, that it's still the same story, I guess, because if you wrote a book about when you were a certain age at a certain time, intellectually, if you redraft it, how do you make sure it's the same? Or for Sherry, if you wrote your book when you were there, and you would go back and redraft it, how do you retain the story, I guess, and the integrity?
Yeah, I mean, it might not be the same book, and I think the book will be different depending on who reads it as well. I think there's no sense for me in literature and life of an absolute truth, and I think things will just naturally change. For me, it was less about redrafting and moving things around and more about just taking certain things out, so the book was a little bit more concise and streamlined, and I think this does tell the absolute truth of what happened, but probably if I did it again in another 10 years, just like the recurring book every decade, it would be very different again, and I think that's just sort of goes to the heart of the nature of writing.
And also, the journey is the journey, so that the actual structure of it. So what you're asking is whether I'd change the character who went on that journey. And one of the things I find a little difficult is the original journey was actually quite a while ago, and what's more disturbing is that this person now is the one dating the 27-year-old. Because he was 10 years younger at the time, and I find that a bit creepy. But therefore I can hold on to the 35-year-old and who she was, and that's okay. But there's another thing in the redrafting for me, because the journey was old, one of the things that I edited for was that things that I visited were that still exist there. So there were a handful of things I needed to take out because they no longer exist. And one was Pee Wee Herman's dinosaur outside of Los Angeles, which is just marvelous and hilarious. And tell them Barb sent you. That was part of my film desire, and so many of the film things have gone. So I did cut some things out because they didn't exist, and I certainly went through to make sure if you read this book and you chose to do the journey because it moved you, that it would still be there. The elements would still be there.
With memoir, as time goes past, do you get further from the truth, do you think?
No, I think you get closer to the truth. I think you get an oversight on yourself, and you get context from how things turned out and what proved to be true or what proved to be false.
Maybe further from the facts, because the memory goes a little bit fuzzy after time, but definitely closer to the truth.
And also the difference between biography and memoir. You're allowed to be fuzzy in memoir. Or so Mark Colvin.
There's some lovely fuzzy things in both of these books. Just before we wrap up today, it's not very often that you get to thank your mother for the wonderful things that she has done for you in her life. Sheridan's mother is here, and today is actually her birthday.
Her 90th birthday, and we're at Melbourne, so
Could we very quickly just sing happy birthday
to you? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Mom. Happy birthday to you. I'm really proud to do that.
Thank you very much. I believe your mother was in advertising, so she'll appreciate the value of a good PR stunt. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the Melbourne Writers Festival session Travel Baggage. Please restore your tray tables to the upright position, and we will be disembarking through this door. Our lovely flight crew this evening has been Sheridan Jobbins, Lisa Dempster, I'm George Dunford. Thank you so much.